What if I revealed that deep within the dense jungles of Burma, a single American general forged a fighting unit of such formidable skill and rigorous training that they achieved an unbroken record in all their nighttime assaults, a stark contrast to other Allied forces being relentlessly battered by the Japanese war machine. This officer's unorthodox strategies cultivated warriors capable of moving like specters through enemy-held territory, striking with sudden ferocity and disappearing before their adversaries could even register their presence. His name was Frank Merrill, and his narrative compels us to re-evaluate our fundamental understanding of military leadership during World War II. This is far more than a simple account of battlefield bravery. It is the previously untold chronicle of how one officer's radical training philosophy transformed 3,000 American volunteers into the most formidable jungle combatants in the Pacific theater. However, the methods he employed were so contentious and so contrary to established military doctrine that they nearly ended his career before solidifying his legendary status. Born on December 4th, 1903 in the unassuming town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, Frank Merrill appeared destined for a conventional military path. He commenced his service as a private in 1922, diligently ascending through the ranks to staff sergeant and ultimately securing his commission to West Point through sheer force of will. Upon his graduation in 1929, he pursued advanced studies in military engineering at MIT, a discipline demanding meticulousness, perseverance, and a profound comprehension of system functionality under duress. Yet, it was his assignment to the United States Embassy in Tokyo in 1938 that irrevocably altered the course of his life and, indeed, American military history. While the majority of American officers underestimated Japanese military capabilities, Merrill dedicated himself to mastering their language, their combat approaches, and, crucially, their mental framework. He did not merely study the Japanese military. He truly grasped its essence. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Merrill was among the rare American officers who were not taken aback by the Japanese military's strategic acumen. By 1943, Merrill found himself in the China-Burma-India theater, observing firsthand how conventional Allied forces were systematically outmaneuvered and annihilated by Japanese jungle warriors. The British had suffered significant defeats, Chinese forces were in retreat, and American standing in Asia had reached an all-time low. It was at this juncture that Churchill and Roosevelt opted for an audacious gamble, authorizing an unprecedented American long-range penetration force designed to confront the Japanese on their own terms. When the Corps went out for volunteers for a perilous and hazardous undertaking, nearly 3,000 men responded. They hailed from every region of America: farmhands from Iowa, streetwise youths from Chicago, university graduates seeking excitement, and seasoned veterans yearning for vindication. What bound them together was not their diverse backgrounds, but their collective resolve to attempt the impossible. Merrill's inaugural decision foreshadowed the unconventional thinking that would define his leadership. While other commanders concentrated on materiel and firepower, Merrill prioritized silence. He understood that in the impenetrable jungles of Burma, the most conspicuous army would be the most vulnerable. Consequently, he began training his soldiers not merely to engage in combat, but to vanish. The training encampment at Deogar became a crucible for groundbreaking military thought. While prevailing wisdom dictated that soldiers should march in formation, communicate via standard radio protocols, and engage in direct confrontation, Merrill advocated for the opposite. His men were instructed to move without a sound, to communicate using hand signals intelligible even in absolute darkness, and to launch attacks from vectors previously deemed impractical by conventional military doctrine. The most groundbreaking facet of Merrill's training regimen was his innovative approach to nocturnal operations. Traditional military thinking viewed nighttime as a period for rest, regrouping, and defensive preparations. Merrill, however, perceived the darkness as his most potent weapon. He spent months conditioning his men not just to operate under the cover of darkness, but to merge with it seamlessly. They learned to navigate by touch, to pinpoint enemy locations through auditory cues, and to orchestrate intricate operations without uttering a single word. At the core of Merrill's philosophy lay a radical redefinition of soldier effectiveness. He rejected the industrial model of warfare that had characterized World War I, where success was measured by firepower and frontal assaults. Instead, he embraced principles that would later be recognized as the hallmarks of special operations: stealth, precision, and psychological manipulation. Merrill astutely recognized that in the Burmese jungle, conventional advantages held no sway. Tanks were incapable of traversing the terrain, artillery could not target unseen adversaries, and air support was rendered useless beneath the dense jungle canopy. The sole advantages that truly mattered were intelligence gathering, swift mobility, and the element of surprise. His training methodologies unequivocally reflected this understanding. While other units engaged in rudimentary parade ground drills, Merrill's soldiers were taught to move through the jungle terrain without disturbing a single leaf. While others emphasized the volume of gunfire, Merrill championed accuracy, instilling in his men the conviction that a single, perfectly placed shot was infinitely more valuable than 100 rounds fired in desperation. The psychological dimension of Merrill's strategy cannot be overstated. He understood that the Japanese military machine operated under the presumption of superiority, confident that Western forces would falter under the rigors of jungle warfare, much as they had in Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. Merrill's brilliance lay in recognizing this very assumption as a critical vulnerability. By cultivating soldiers who not only endured but excelled in environments that had decimated other Allied units, he directly challenged the bedrock of Japanese confidence. The training regimen developed by Merrill was unlike anything previously encountered in conventional military education. His men were trained to discern individual Japanese soldiers by their breathing patterns. They mastered the art of traversing dense undergrowth without producing the telltale rustling that had betrayed so many other Allied patrols. They developed an almost preternatural capacity for coordinating complex maneuvers through subtle gestures, signals that could be transmitted and received in absolute blackness. Perhaps Merrill's most profound insight, however, was his comprehension of how the very terrain could be weaponized. While other commanders viewed the Burmese jungle as an obstacle to be overcome, Merrill saw it as an indispensable ally to be embraced. He instructed his men to decipher the jungle like an open book, understanding how sound propagated through various types of foliage, how atmospheric conditions influenced visibility and movement, and how the behavior of local wildlife could provide crucial intelligence regarding enemy activities. This profound connection with their surroundings permeated every facet of the Marauders' operations. They learned to identify edible flora for sustenance, medicinal herbs for common ailments, and natural camouflage materials far superior to any manufactured alternative. They became so synchronized with the rhythms of jungle life that they could detect human presence through subtle shifts in animal behavior. The meticulous selection and training of the indigenous guides who would collaborate with the Marauders revealed another facet of Merrill's pioneering mindset. Rather than treating these local combatants as subordinates or mere escorts, Merrill recognized them as indispensable partners whose expertise was paramount to success. He insisted that his men not only learn to cooperate with the native peoples, but to think as they did, to comprehend the jungle from the perspective of individuals who had spent their entire lives within its embrace. Most crucially, Merrill understood that jungle warfare was as much a psychological contest as a physical one. He trained his soldiers not merely to combat the Japanese, but to infiltrate their minds. The Marauders learned to exploit the Japanese army's own tactical doctrine, appearing in locations where they were least expected and vanishing before effective countermeasures could be implemented. This psychological warfare extended beyond mere tactical maneuvers. Merrill comprehended that his men were not simply confronting Japanese soldiers. They were confronting the pervasive myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle combat. Every successful operation, every flawlessly executed night raid, every instance where his soldiers materialized in locations deemed impossible for Americans to survive by conventional military standards, served to dismantle decades of ingrained assumptions about Western military capabilities in Asian theaters. The almost religious fervor with which Merrill approached training underscored his realization that he was not merely creating soldiers, but an entirely new breed of warrior. These individuals would require not only physical courage, but also intellectual adaptability, emotional fortitude, and a near mystical connection to their environment. They needed to be scholars of conflict, artists of violence, and philosophers of survival, all rolled into one. The validation of Merrill's groundbreaking methods arrived in February of 1944, when his 2,750 Marauders advanced into Burma. What ensued was a masterclass in unconventional warfare that would profoundly influence American military thinking for generations to come. At Wallaboom, the Marauders demonstrated the efficacy of Merrill's silent infiltration tactics, navigating terrain that Japanese commanders deemed impassable. They emerged behind enemy lines like phantoms. The Japanese 18th Division, seasoned veterans who had conquered Singapore and Malaysia, found themselves facing an adversary operating under an entirely different set of rules. The nocturnal assaults became legendary. Merrill had so thoroughly conditioned his men in silent movement and communication that they could coordinate complex offensives in absolute darkness without alerting sentries mere yards away. Japanese forces, who prided themselves on their night fighting prowess, were repeatedly outmaneuvered by Americans who seemed to materialize from the very jungle itself. The Battle of Nepomukar became the ultimate proving ground for Merrill's doctrines. For 10 days, the 2nd Battalion found itself encircled by overwhelming Japanese forces on what would become known as Maggot Hill, a position so isolated and desperate that conventional military wisdom would have dictated immediate evacuation or surrender. Instead, Merrill's training revealed its true genius. The besieged Marauders not only survived, but thrived. Employing the silent communication techniques they had perfected, they orchestrated defensive operations that consistently repelled Japanese assaults. They transformed the jungle terrain into a weapon, utilizing their intimate knowledge of sight lines and acoustic patterns to create kill zones that baffled and thwarted Japanese commanders. During the siege, individual Marauders would stealthily slip beyond the perimeter under the cover of darkness, not to escape, but to gather intelligence on Japanese positions and movements. They would return before dawn with detailed information, enabling their comrades to anticipate and neutralize enemy tactics. This level of nocturnal infiltration and reconnaissance was unprecedented in conventional warfare. The psychological impact of Nepomukar on Japanese forces was immense. Here were American soldiers, presumed to be inferior in jungle warfare, not only surviving but actively hunting Japanese troops within their own domain. The confidence that had propelled the Japanese military to numerous victories across Asia began to erode under the strain of confronting an enemy they could neither predict nor comprehend. However, Merrill's innovations extended beyond mere tactics. He revolutionized the entire concept of military logistics in hostile territory. Recognizing that traditional supply lines would render his force susceptible to detection and counterattack, he pioneered techniques for self-sufficiency and the strategic use of airdrops that maintained operational security. The aerial resupply system Merrill devised was a testament to precision and timing. His men learned to identify drop zones by subtle topographical features that were imperceptible to Japanese observers, but clearly discernible to trained eyes. They mastered the art of retrieving supplies while leaving no trace of their presence, a skill demanding not only physical dexterity, but an almost artistic understanding of how to restore natural environments following human intrusion. The medical advancements born from necessity within the Marauders became standard practice for subsequent special operations units. Merrill's soldiers were trained to treat tropical diseases with indigenous remedies, perform battlefield surgery with improvised instruments, and maintain combat effectiveness despite physical incapacitation that would have rendered conventional soldiers immobile. The division of his force into 6 distinctly color-coded combat teams, red, white, blue, khaki, green, and orange, afforded unparalleled tactical agility. Each team possessed the capability to operate independently, yet they were trained to synchronize their actions in ways that exponentially amplified their collective efficacy. The capture of Maidkina Airfield represented the culmination of Merrill's revolutionary strategies. The approach march necessitated his men traversing mountainous terrain that Japanese strategists had dismissed as impassable for infantry movement. For days, the Marauders ascended through conditions that claimed pack animals and pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. When they finally descended upon Maidkina, the Japanese forces were caught completely off guard. Merrill's soldiers had accomplished what conventional military wisdom deemed impossible. They had moved a force of sufficient size to seize a major airfield across terrain that enemy planners believed would thwart any attempt at infiltration. The assault itself showcased every innovation Merrill had developed. Teams advanced with the stealth of predatory felines, coordinating intricate maneuvers through signals that Japanese observers could neither detect nor decipher. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the illusion of a force far larger than their actual numbers. Perhaps most remarkably, when Japanese reinforcements arrived, they discovered that the Americans had already transformed the captured airfield into a defensive stronghold, leveraging every principle of jungle warfare that Merrill had imparted. The Marauders had effectively become one with the environment in which they fought, indistinguishable from the terrain, impervious to eradication, and capable of striking from any direction at any moment. Merrill's methodologies were not without their detractors. Conventional military commanders questioned whether his emphasis on unconventional tactics would translate effectively to conventional battlefield scenarios. Some contended that his training methods were excessively specialized, producing soldiers who might excel in jungle warfare but falter in other theaters. The physical toll exacted by Merrill's approach was undeniable. The relentless tempo of operations, compounded by the brutal conditions of the Burmese jungle, decimated his ranks. Malaria, typhus, and dysentery proved to be more lethal adversaries than Japanese bullets. By the time Maidkina fell in August of 1944, only 130 of the original 2,750 Marauders remained fit for duty. Critics pointed to these casualty rates as evidence that Merrill had pushed his men beyond the limits of human endurance, arguing that a more conventional approach might have achieved similar objectives with fewer losses. The debate over whether Merrill was a visionary leader or a commander who sacrificed his men for glory would persist long after the war concluded. Furthermore, there was the question of scalability. Merrill's methods demanded exceptional individuals, men possessing the intellect, physical prowess, and psychological resilience to master extraordinarily demanding skills. Could such techniques be replicated for larger, conventional forces, or were they intrinsically limited to elite units? The most disconcerting criticism was directed at Merrill himself. On March 29, 1944, he suffered his first heart attack and had to be evacuated from the field. Some questioned whether his demanding leadership style was as unsustainable as the operational pace he imposed upon his men. As we reflect on Frank Merrill's legacy, we see a commander who fundamentally reshaped America's approach to unconventional warfare. The principles he cultivated in the jungles of Burma, an emphasis on stealth over firepower, precision over volume, and psychological engagement over brute force, became the bedrock of modern special operations forces. Today's Army Rangers trace their lineage directly back to Merrill's Marauders. The techniques he pioneered for nocturnal operations, infiltration tactics, and small unit coordination continue to be taught at Ranger School. Camp Frank Merrill in Georgia, where the mountain phase of Ranger training takes place, stands as a perpetual monument to his innovations. However, perhaps Merrill's most significant contribution was not tactical, but philosophical. He demonstrated that in warfare, as in life, the entity that thinks differently often possesses the decisive advantage. While his contemporaries focused on confronting enemy strength with superior force, Merrill proved that superior intellect could overcome superior numbers. The Marauders' flawless record in nighttime operations stands as a testament to the power of this approach. They never lost a night raid because they never engaged in the kind of battle their adversaries anticipated. In an era where military doctrine prioritized frontal assaults and overwhelming power, Merrill taught his men to triumph through intelligence, meticulous preparation, and flawless execution. Ultimately, Frank Merrill's story serves as a potent reminder that genuine leadership is not about commanding respect through authority, but about earning it through innovation. In the darkest jungles of World War II, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by conventional wisdom, he forged something entirely novel. His men did not merely fight for victory. They fought with a precision that fundamentally altered the very nature of warfare. Though the jungle may have claimed many of the original Marauders, their legacy endures. Every special operations mission, every ranger patrol, every unit that values stealth over sheer strength carries a fragment of Frank Merrill's revolutionary vision. He trained his men in silence, and their triumphs resonate throughout history. This is the true measure of a leader. Not solely the battles they win, but the ideas they impart. In Frank Merrill's case, he left behind more than mere tactics or techniques. He bequeathed a new paradigm for understanding what is achievable when conventional wisdom collides with unconventional courage.